Welcome back. Dr. Joseph Sergini again, teaching you criminological theory. So the next thing we're going to look at is the pre-classical and classical theories of crime. So now we're really getting into that first school criminology, right? We're really looking at some of the understandings. And you're going to see when we get to this first era, this pre-classical, we're going pretty far back, right? We're going pretty far back in human history. When we talk about early human history, we know that as soon as we developed any type of natural society, you can look back to the cavemen when they started to group together, and then we moved out of the caves and we started to develop structured societies, that people started harming each other and people started committing other offenses. They started to steal things. They started to specifically uh, try to disrupt any organized, if there was a so-called government, they tried to disrupt the government. We tried to hurt each other, right? So the early understandings really focused on this idea of supernatural, that it was really God and the devil, right? So this idea of some good versus evil. Now, we tend to look at the God versus the devil in more of a Catholic Church understanding. We'll see, we'll get there in the Middle Ages. But really, it's this idea of that there's good and there's evil. So whether you call him God, Yahweh, Allah, Buddha, any other type of higher being, and whether you call him the devil, Satan, the prince of darkness, anything like that, there's some supernatural cause of crime. So very, very early on, we're still looking at it as men, and specifically because it was men who were committing those crimes, that human beings, we'll use that phrase instead, are influenced by supernatural forces. As we started to build into the Middle Ages with the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church still has some applications in the modern times, as you see on the slide, the Catholic Church really started to establish this idea of not only that it still is a problem of sin, of influence, of the devil and the devil's agents, but on top of that, this idea that we need to both be subservient to government, so government established by man, and then be respectful and good stewards of, specifically because the Catholics are Christian, of Jesus Christ and the Lord God. So often you hear the line, a lot of Catholics hear the line, render unto Caesar, when they're talking about like taxes and money. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, is render unto the Lord what is the Lord's. It's this idea of, two, when we're talking about discussions of crime, follow the laws that are written both in the Bible and also by man's government. And there has been some issues, obviously, in modern times with how the church is presented, that they're realistic in the fact that they operate in many nations around the world with more than 1 billion people who self-identify as Catholics, and they're not always going to be in governments that are religious-based, right? They're going to be non-theological based governments. So when you look at that, they can't just enforce things by a pure religious means. So they've tried to balance that structure. We also know that Islam is also one of the largest religions in the world, more than 1 billion people as well. So they obviously have established different structures, including their own court systems. So when you were looking at this counterplay, especially during things like the Crusades and all these differences here, you had a conflict between what was considered a crime and then how they were punished. But what was pretty uniformly the same amongst all of them was this idea of swift and severe. And you'll see what I mean as we go on. It was make sure that people are punished quickly and severely, including corporal punishment, and make sure that everybody sees it, right? So some of the earliest codes were things like the Code of Hammurabi, an eye for an eye, a hand for a hand. You go to steal an item from someone, they can take your hand so you can't steal again. It's this more make it pretty swift and severe. Eventually, we got to what's called the Age of Enlightenment. You see here it's 1651. And that's, what we're going to do throughout this course is we are going to look at some of the theorists, because each and one of these schools have important principal agents built within them that really help guide why are they important in criminology, and how did we come to this idea of this is a theory we can look at to explore crime. So one of the things I always mention to the students is, yeah, you're probably going to be tested, and I can tell you are, on some of the theorists, so you should pay attention to them. So the first is Hobbes. And you can see here what Hobbes argued in his seminal writing in 1651 that really looked at crime. And what it really builds into, and the reason why I capitalized it for you guys, is this idea of rationality. No matter what Hobbes is writing here about how the rules are created and how the rules should be enforced and what should punishment look like, Hobbes is arguing this theory of rationality. Now, later on, you'll see things like rational choice theory, but what he's really saying here is human beings have the ability that is afforded to them, and many times he does recognize the authority of things like a God or a creator, this ability to have free will, to make a choice. And he argues that most human beings will make a choice that is rational to them. If they can get away with a crime and not be punished for it, they're going to view that as rational. They're not going to view it necessarily as breaking the rules and the morals and the values of society. They're going to say, I'm not being punished, so why not do it? Versus if they know they're going to be punished, then why are there some people who still break the law? What is their rational thought pattern there? Hobbes was one of the first. Eventually, what this established was this idea of a social contract. What it's really broken down to, what Hobbes argues in essence, and it wasn't just Hobbes, it was other theorists like John Locke as well, is that by the time of the second part of the Age of Enlightenment, we have written together as a society an unofficial contract that we all agree to, which basically says, as long as we follow the rules that are laid out, whatever's codified in the law, and also morals and values that the majority of us agree upon. So if you're in a religious society, you follow religious laws. If you're not religious, you follow the moral laws that have been established. If you follow them, then you won't be punished unfairly. As a matter of fact, you won't be punished at all because you'll be abiding by the social contract. It's the minute you violate a social contract, when you break the law, we have to protect the rest of society. It's basically looking as the all as a sum of their parts. If one violates, that one has to be punished so the rest of society can be made secure. They also argued that the government has to be directly representative of the people, which means that the people have to be able to have a voice in what the laws are going to be. And you're going to notice some of the rights that they have to pursue. These were codified in our founding documents. Locke and Hobbes and Thomas Paine, for example, had a lot of prominence in American Revolution. Specifically, while they might not have been alive in the instance of Hobbes, Thomas Paine was. And they borrowed, each of these new theorists would borrow from each other. So Locke and would borrow from Hobbes, and Paine would borrow from Locke, etc., to build out these ideas. And basically, what it boils down to is, since you have the right to pursue those specific goals that are written on the slide, that means then that you have the ability to consider the consequences of your actions. Again, assuming that all human beings are rational. And that's a really key point of the pre-classical and even the classical school. We are not even approaching discussions around biology, around psychology and psychiatric issues, around society, technically in terms of, are we going to give excuses or exemptions for violators of the law? We are saying you as the individual are the main agent here. You are the person who has the ability to choose to be rational or not and to consider the consequences of your actions. Eventually, the classical school evolved into Cesare Beccaria. And basically, what he wrote in 1764 on crimes and punishment was an argument of what we call deterrence. So the textbook has a picture, and I put it here for you guys, of Beccaria. But basically, he was a theorist of law and very young. You know, again, 26 is young for us in modern society, relatively older for then, when some time periods life expectancy only reached like the mid-30s. So a little bit of an older man for his time, but younger for us. But this idea of what are we going to look at? And specifically, he wanted to reform the justice system at the time. He said the legislatures have to sit down, and if we believe in a social contract, really have to tell the people these are the laws you have to abide by. So really start enforcing and writing down crimes, and not only enforcing them, but legislating by saying these are the crimes that we're not okay with, and attached to those crimes are punishments. So because crime is these laws, I should say, I think I said crimes, attached to these laws are punishments. We know that crime is harmful. And since crime is harmful to society, we need to stop it. Also, too, he kept some things that were accounted for even in our own Constitution, like the right to confront a witness. Should notice for a lot of you who specifically like the law and maybe even like constitutional law, here's where we're getting our underlying theories for the American Constitution. But he argued just because punishment should be swift and severe and certain, he didn't agree with things like torture, which is actually really important because things like the Code of Hammurabi back in the earlier time periods did allow for things like torture. He said, no, that's against human behavior. In essence, what it should be looked at is basically a violation of your rights. So he's talking a lot about due process without even really necessarily saying the word due process. He also mentioned that judges can't just be these arbitrary people, because what happens when you put judges into a position of authority is that they start to rule sometimes against what is logical and rational, that it should be your peers. It should be a public punishment. So when you have a trial jury by your peers, you can trace this to Bakara, right? You can trace this back to these reforms and ideas that he was talking about. And he believed that a better educated society was a society that committed less crimes. Some of these ideas we still believe in. As a matter of fact, some of you might be sitting there saying, I'm a classical school theorist. As you go out throughout your study here, as a student of both criminology and criminal justice, especially a class on criminological theory, I really want you to start thinking about what type of theories that explain crime make the most sense to you, and really start to explore them even further than what I show you here in the lectures or even in your readings, because it's going to help guide you as you go on throughout your studies in really crafting your worldview on how we should approach not only prevention of crime, but also our response to criminality in general. How should we be treating some of these criminals? Bakar actually didn't like the death penalty, which is unique because in American society, we established the Eighth Amendment, rules against cruel and unusual punishment. But our founders didn't really kind of touch the capital punishment issue. They kind of left it out there in the open. And Bakar was saying, hey, listen, if you're going to read some of my stuff, which some of the founders were, they were heavily involved in reading theory and reading some of the classical writings of the time. Again, Bakar is around their time period. If you're going to read my opinions, I am adamantly against the death penalty. And I've specifically pulled a quote out for you as to why he was adamant against the death penalty. I'm not going to read it off to you. But one of the biggest things was he felt it was not a good deterrent, which is very interesting because we have capital punishment today, even though it might not be widely used because we've had moratoriums on it, and there's been a lot of governors who have said, I'm not going to authorize executions in my state once they get in elected office. We still have it, and yet people still kill. So it is a legitimate question around, is it actually a deterrence or not? To the point that he said deterrence must have three components to it in order to actually work. One of the biggest things that he had a problem with in the earlier days with the arbitrary judges in the society that he was existing in was that it would take time for people to be tried. He didn't like that. Now, obviously, this did cause a problem when it was first instituted, with where people's due process rights afforded, where all evidence was presented against them, was it legitimately presented, because it does often, for some crimes, take time to find out what happened. And it didn't always occur in some of these instances. But also, too, he said we shouldn't just wait. There shouldn't be just constant, in essence, stonewalling. What we have now in the modern system of appeals and basically delays in the process, it should be swift. We shouldn't wait too long to punish people. They need to suffer the consequences of their actions. And then certainty and severity is you should know what sentence you're getting. There shouldn't be a question. And it should match up with the crime that was committed. So if a person steals a loaf of bread, don't kill them. That doesn't make sense. But if you're going to give them a punishment, make certain if it's like we do now with things like restitution, or with repeated offenses, we would explore the possibility of incarceration for like thefts. Make certain that they know, okay, how many offenses, if you're going to wait for multiple offenses, am I considered a repeat offender? Now I'm going to be punished. So you see here, swiftness, as we explored here, certainty, most important quality. He wants to make certain that, again, it must be something where we don't get too far above what it should be. And then severity. And what he really argued here, and I kind of want to touch on the three strike laws part, that's why I mentioned it, is he could be argued as a proponent of three strike laws, but also argued against it. And that's the weirdness of his theory, in my opinion. If we're going to constantly punish people, make certain they're swift and severe, he would argue on deterrence, why would you need a three strike law, right? If the punishment was severe enough, it was swift, certain, and severe, why would there possibly need to be a punishment for a second or even third offense? They should stop it at the first. But since he did argue that some people might not stop with severity, it might not be a true deterrent, and it might, especially if it doesn't keep them from engaging in the crime, then he would be an argument, a proponent for three strike laws. It's interesting that he's included in here because obviously three strike laws have reached a point of controversy, including at one point in time, versions of three strike laws have been ruled unconstitutional in the United States. When we talk about deterrence, there are a couple different types. The first one is specific. You see the definition here. And again, when you're looking at this definition of specific versus general, it's focused on who is being deterred. It's pretty easy to arrest an individual and throw them behind bars. And if they're behind bars for 10 years, well, they're not committing an offense anymore. They are specifically deterred. But what about everybody else? How do we stop all offenders, not just one person, all offenders from committing crimes? And that was the argument for capital punishment, especially in the United States. It would be a message. It would say, hey, if you engage in these acts, you're going to be put to death possibly if you qualify for capital punishment. Do you really want to engage in these acts? And some people would obviously engage in them and other people wouldn't. It would be a deterrent. So these are some of the ideas. In the U.S. justice system, what he really laid the frameworks for, and we do include Hobbes and Locke and even Thomas Paine laying the framework for, was due process and individual rights. Our founders really were looking at, as I said before, these theorists and specifically what they were writing and saying, hey, we're going to use this as part of the Bill of Rights. So you can trace Beccaria to things such as the Eighth Amendment, the spirit of it. No cruel and unusual punishment. So he didn't like the death penalty. So it is interesting that we do have the death penalty in the United States. You can trace basically Hobbes and even Beccaria to things like the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment and even the Sixth Amendment. Okay, so we do have connections to them. You see here, specifically, you can account Beccaria for cross exams, the right to a speedy trial, so that's swiftness, and the right to be informed by decisions of a judge, right? So informed specifically of accusations against you. Jeremy Bentham, basically, in essence, if you want to use the word took over, was the next step of what Beccaria was looking at. And he looked at some of the issues specifically around deterrence and why people were continuing to commit crimes by looking at it, the idea of what's called a hedonistic calculus. If people are going to commit a crime, it's in essence a cost to benefit analysis. What is going to be my pain if I'm caught for the immediacy of the pleasure of the crime? What I often say to students in criminology, in my classes on the undergraduate level, is let's be frank and honest about crime. There are certain crimes that are fun for people to commit. They are certainly pleasurable in terms of they're getting away with money, they're getting away with violations of the law that other people can't get away with. So if they're not caught and they're not punished, they're going to keep engaging in it because they're suffering no pain. The minute they suffer a formal sanction is where things are different. And what he was basically arguing was the people who continue to engage in the pain after they've been punished, they continue to commit crimes after they've been punished, are often hedonistic. There's some way like they're trying to seek it out. So the example that was pulled out of the textbook was the DC madam. She had no problem continuing her engagement in prostitution and escort services until she was officially sanctioned for her crimes. And then she committed suicide before she was sentenced. That's a pretty powerful argument for, I'm going to keep engaging in this behavior, but then the minute the walls come crashing down upon me, I'm going to find a way out. But also, too, Jeremy Bentham was known for the word that's in bold. And I say to students all the time, something in bold definitely means you definitely want to know it. Now, it's not that you shouldn't write definitions for all the other stuff, but this is also one you definitely want to know because it's going to be on a test, which is basically a total institution, right? So in Europe and then here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, it was an institution in which you were either confined to your own cell, so solitary confinement, and you weren't allowed to speak, and you had to do manual labor, or you were confined to a group of people and you still weren't allowed to speak, and your only contact was with clergy. Either of those systems really just said, hey, you need to be separated from society. You need to suffer that punishment of being away from the group. So in essence, the panopticon is something that we even still use today. Eventually, all this evolved, though, into the neoclassical, where we still can account for this idea of rational choice and ability to think and make decisions, but the individual needs to be taken into account, right? So that's how we balance out punishment. It's this idea of, do we merit out a punishment for the person if they have drug addiction, if they have basically problems with their socioeconomic status? Like, what are factors you take into play? Was there something where they were being like deliberately harmed by this person and their way of breaking free was by killing them, right? This mitigating or aggravating circumstances. We do talk about a lot of these different things, but as I mentioned before, these two schools actually eventually went away once Charles Darwin went onto the scene. Now, they didn't completely go away. They still have some prominence even today, but they really lost a lot of importance because we started to look at it as a biological issue. So the policy implications were pretty clear cut with the classical and the neoclassical school. We've mentioned the death penalty a lot. Pretty clear it's not a deterrent, but it's still used because it's severe punishment. We have also enacted by when crime outbreaks occur, we put more cops on the street, we're more visible. It is more giving you the choice to make the decision not to commit the crime. So when you rush a ton of police officers into a scene, you're enacting a classical or even neoclassical theory, which is, if you commit a crime, you're going to be likely caught because the cops are there and you're going to get arrested, and we're going to pretty much enforce this whole total institution on you if we have to throw you behind bars or even process you. So this is going to devolve pretty quickly. And then for the longest time, we used programs such as Scared Straight, which have fallen out of favor, but did have some benefit by basically saying to people, do you want to be like this? Like, do you see what's happening to other people? It feeds into that basic hedonistic calculus. Are you still getting pleasure from knowing that this is what your future is and this is what it could be? So that's one of the first set of theories in criminological theory. And I thank you for your time.